I pretended to drag my suitcase and leave on vacation just to please my children, but I was actually hiding, watching from my neighbor's curtains. I froze when I saw my daughter-in-law throw the door open, turning my sacred home into a cheap, by-the-hour motel the second she thought I was out of sight. Hello, everyone. Please go ahead and find a comfortable spot. Maybe settle into your favorite armchair with a warm cup of tea and really listen closely. The story I'm about to share with you today is not just some stranger's drama or a headline from the news. It is the kind of thing that could happen under your own roof, right under your nose, involving the people you love and trust the most. Today, I need to unburden my heart and tell you about the day my entire world fell apart. It was not because of a hurricane or a terrible diagnosis, but because of a cold, calculated betrayal by the son I carried, birthed, and raised. My name is Margaret. I am just a regular woman, probably a lot like you. I love my grandchildren, I adore my children, and I cherish every single memory built into the walls of my old house. But it seems my kindness was used against me in the cruelest way possible. If you are listening, and you are a mother too, you might understand this pain. I hope you are ready to walk this difficult path with me, because I really need someone to listen. Madi, everything started out so perfectly. Honestly, it was too perfect. My son, David, and his wife, Jessica, suddenly insisted that I go on a trip to visit my sister down in North Carolina. They kept telling me how tired I looked, how I needed a break, and how I deserved to relax by the coast. David even booked the bus ticket himself, his eyes shining with a strange kind of excitement that I could not quite place. But the way they rushed me to pack my bags, the way Jessica kept stealing nervous glances at the clock on the wall, it made my insides burn like I had swallowed fire. That was my intuition kicking in. It is that God-given gut feeling every woman has, that internal radar designed to protect her nest. I kept thinking about the lock on my late husband's bedroom door. Just last week, I tried to go in there to dust, but the key would not turn. Jessica told me the humidity had jammed the old mechanism, but she would not look me in the eye when she said it. And the whispering in the house always stopped dead the second I walked into a room. Something was wrong, very, very wrong. So this morning, I did something crazy. I let David drive me to the station. I waved goodbye with a stiff, fake smile. But the moment his car disappeared around the bend, I hailed a taxi and came straight back. I did not go to my own front door, though. Instead, I slipped into the house of my neighbor, Mr. Arthur, right across the street. Now, I'm sitting here in the dark in Arthur's living room, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I pull back the edge of the curtain just an inch. From this vantage point, I can see my house clearly across the street. That is the home my husband and I paid a mortgage on for 30 long years, sweating and saving for every brick. Twilight has just settled in, and suddenly, the porch light flicks on. That is strange because I never leave that light on. Electricity is not cheap these days. And then, the nightmare unfolds right before my eyes. A car I do not recognize pulls up to the curb. A young couple gets out, dragging a rolling suitcase behind them. My front door swings wide open. It is Jessica. She does not look sad that her mother-in-law is gone. No, she is beaming with a bright, fake smile, looking for all the world like a receptionist at a hotel check-in counter. I feel like I have died standing up when I see her take a thick wad of cash from the stranger's hand and usher them inside. She is inviting strangers into my sanctuary, into the place where I raised my babies. My heart feels like it is being squeezed in a vice. My breath comes in short, painful gasps, and there is a sharp pain in my chest. They did not care about my health or my vacation. They just wanted me out of the way so they could turn my sacred home into a cheap rental, a shady business right behind my back. The trust, the motherly love, it all shattered in that instant, hurting more than any physical blow ever could. I sank deep into Arthur's old armchair, my body heavy as lead, but my eyes refused to leave that lit window across the street. The scene playing out over there felt like a slow-motion movie designed to slice my heart into ribbons, one frame at a time. That dining room. That was where we were supposed to be carving the Thanksgiving turkey, passing around gravy boats, and listening to the children laugh. But tonight, there was no turkey. There was no laughter. Instead, David and Jessica were sitting there at my polished oak table, the one I have kept scratch-free for decades, dumping out a pile of cash. I watched through the gap in the curtains as crumbled 20, 50, and $100 bills spilled across the wood. And David, my son, the boy who I thought was drowning in debt, picked up those bills with a look of greed I had never seen on his face before. They sorted the money into white envelopes, their movements quick and practiced. Then I saw Jessica reach for a bottle on the sideboard. My breath hitched. That was the bottle of wine my late husband and I had been saving for our golden anniversary. It was dust-covered and precious, a symbol of enduring love. How they were popping the cork to toast their success and tricking me out of my own home. Watching David laugh and clink glasses with his wife, a knot of physical pain tightened in my chest. It wasn't just about the wine, it was the naked truth staring me in the face. They weren't struggling. They weren't worried about that $30,000 debt David had cried to me about just last month. They were making money off my dignity. Their filial piety, that sudden urge to send me on a relaxing vacation, was nothing but a smokescreen for a dirty business deal run out of my living room. Memories came flooding back, suffocating me as they clashed with the bitter reality across the street. I thought back to the days right after my husband passed. David was just starting college. To keep that roof over our heads, to make sure David didn't have to drop out, I worked like a machine. 2 nursing shifts a day, my feet swollen so bad I could barely fit them in my shoes, lunches that were nothing but dry sandwiches eaten on the run. I took every cent of my husband's life insurance payout, money that was supposed to be for my old age, and used it to pay off the mortgage. All I wanted was for this house to be a forever sanctuary for my children. I sacrificed everything. I haven't bought myself a decent new dress in 10 years. I drive a car that rattles and shakes just so David could have a newer model for his work. I gave them my money, my health, my time. I truly believe David was a gentle soul, just a victim of hard times. But the man counting money across the street isn't the boy I rocked to sleep. He is an accomplice. The way he wouldn't look at me when he lied about the bedroom lock being broken. The way he whispered in corners with Jessica. It wasn't clumsiness. It was calculation. He chose his wife and her greed over his own mother. A soft clink brought me back. Arthur had quietly placed a cup of hot tea in my hands. The warmth seeped into my cold fingers, snapping me out of the trance of the past. I looked down at my hands, wrinkled, worn, the hands that had built that family across the street. I realized I was done crying. That deep, aching sadness was hardening into something else entirely. It felt colder, sharper. It was the righteous anger of a homeowner whose castle has been breached, the fury of a mother betrayed. I finally understood. That bedroom lock didn't break because of humidity, like Jessica claimed. That was the first step in their plan to lock me out of my own life, to erase my husband's memory so they could sell sleeping space to strangers. They saw me as an obstacle, a piece of furniture to be moved around in the house I own. I wiped my face dry. There would be no sleep for me tonight. I was done being the frail, gullible Margaret. Enough is enough, I whispered into the darkness, my voice steady and low. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be running away. I would be starting a new life, one that begins with facing them down. I need a plan, and I need a cold head to take back what is mine. I woke up when the morning sun filtered through the blinds of Arthur's guest room, casting a soft, dusty beam of light onto the old wool blanket I had pulled over myself last night. For 40 years, my body has reacted to the sunrise in the exact same way. My first instinct was to bolt upright, my mind already racing through a mental checklist. Start the coffee maker, toast the bread, make sure David and Jessica had a hot breakfast before they rushed out the door. My feet were halfway to the floor before the silence of this strange room pulled me back to reality. I wasn't in that house anymore. I wasn't the unpaid housekeeper for ungrateful children anymore. I sank back into the pillows and took a breath that felt deeper than any I had taken in years. The aroma of Arthur's fresh brewed coffee drifted up from the kitchen, mixing with the comforting, musty scent of old paperbacks that lined the walls. For the first time in forever, my chest felt light. There was no one calling my name, no blaring television, no critical eyes watching my every move. I got up and made myself a cup of tea, standing by the window. I made a conscious choice not to look across the street at my own home. Instead, I looked up at the endless, crisp blue sky. The sharp pain of last night had settled into a strange, quiet peace. I realized then that when you finally put down a burden you have been carrying for too long, the world suddenly feels vast and gentle. After a quiet breakfast with Arthur, I decided to step outside. Usually, if I'm out at this hour, I'm rushing to the market to hunt for discount coupons or plan dinner. But today, I was walking just for me. I strolled down the familiar neighborhood sidewalks, but everything looked different. The old oak trees seemed to offer more shade, and I could actually hear the birds singing, a sound I had been too busy and too worried to notice for years. I stopped at that little bakery on the corner and did something I never do. I ordered a zesty lemon tart and sat at a small outdoor table to eat it, all by myself. I watched the world go by and realized how much of Margaret I had lost. I used to be the woman who loved floral dresses and singing hymns in the church choir on Sundays. Somehow, I had let myself fade into a gray, silent shadow, living only for her son. So, I walked into a boutique and bought myself a turquoise silk scarf. It was the color my late husband always loved on me. As I wrapped the cool, smooth fabric around my neck, I felt my spine straighten. I felt younger. I didn't buy a single thing for David or Jessica. Every cent I spent today was an investment in my own healing. I am finally learning to love myself again before it is too late. Late that afternoon, I went to the park by the lake to meet Sarah. Sarah isn't just the sharpest lawyer in our town. She has been my best friend since high school. We found a bench in a quiet spot near the water. When I saw her walking toward me with her signature short, practical haircut and that confident stride of hers, I felt like a drowning woman spotting a lifeboat. I told her everything. I didn't hold back a single detail. I told her about the bedroom lock that supposedly broke, the trip they forced on me, and the cheap boarding house they turned my home into the second I left. Sarah just listened. She didn't interrupt. I saw the flash of anger in her eyes, but her hands were warm and steady when she reached out to hold mine. She didn't judge me for being a naive mother. She didn't offer empty platitudes. Her solid presence gave me a strength I didn't know I had left. I know now that I'm not fighting this battle alone. We started to talk about the first steps, not to seek blind revenge, but to restore the dignity and honor of my home. I am ready now. The silence of the late afternoon in Arthur's living room was shattered by a sound that made my blood run cold. My cell phone, sitting on the polished oak coffee table, began to buzz and vibrate violently against the wood, sounding for all the world like a small animal in its death throes. The screen lit up, piercing the dim light, and there it was. The name David flashed across the glass, accompanied by his graduation photo. He looked so innocent in that picture, wearing his cap and gown, smiling that bright, hopeful smile that used to make my chest swell with pride. In the past, seeing this call would have sent a wave of joy through me. I would have scrambled to answer on the first ring, eager to hear his voice. But today, looking at that smiling face, my stomach twisted into a tight, nauseous knot. A mix of disgust and fear washed over me. I knew deep in my bones that they were not calling because they missed their mother. They were calling to make sure the obstacle had been successfully removed. They were checking to see if the coast was clear. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady the rhythm of my heart, which was beating against my ribs like a wild drum. Arthur, sitting across from me in his armchair, gave me a slow, firm nod. His eyes were steady, pouring a silent strength into me. I reached out and swiped the screen, lifting the phone to my ear, but I didn't say hello. I just listened. For a second, there was just static. Then, Jessica's voice poured through the speaker, dripping with a sweetness so fake it made my teeth ache. It wasn't David. Of course it wasn't. She launched into a performance worthy of an award, her voice lilting and musical. She asked how the bus ride was, if my legs were cramping, and how my sister was doing in North Carolina. It was the perfect script of a caring daughter-in-law, the kind you see in TV commercials. But I wasn't watching a commercial. I was listening to a predator testing the fence line, making sure her prey was far, far away. After the hollow pleasantries were out of the way, the tone shifted. I could practically hear the gears grinding as she pivoted to the real reason for the call. The sweetness dropped an octave into a tone of staged concern. Jessica started sighing, talking about how difficult things were back at home. She hesitated, acting as if she didn't want to burden me, before dropping the lie. She told me that the heating system in the old house had started making a terrible clanking noise the moment I left. She painted a vivid picture of David pacing the floor, unable to eat or sleep, sick with worry about how much a contractor would charge to fix the furnace when his business was already so slow. She made him sound like a martyr, carrying the weight of the world, while they were supposedly just trying to protect their fragile old mother. Then came the trap. Her voice softened to a whisper, sounding almost like she was begging for a favor for my own good. She suggested that maybe, just maybe, I should extend my trip. She told me I should stay with my sister for another 2 weeks, maybe even a month, to avoid the dust and the noise of the repairs. It would be better for my lungs, she said. And then, the kicker. She asked, ever so gently, if I could possibly wire them some emergency funds from my savings account, just a few $1,000s, so David could pay the deposit for the repairman immediately. I felt a chill go down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The audacity was breathtaking. They were not only using my home to run an illegal hotel business behind my back, pocketing cash from strangers, but that they were also trying to drain my retirement savings from a distance. Their greed was a bottomless pit. They wanted to wring every last cent out of me, even after they had kicked me to the curb. In the old days, the Margaret I used to be would have been in a panic. I would have been apologizing profusely for the broken heater, feeling guilty that my house was causing my son stress. I would have been scrambling to find my bank token to authorize the transfer within minutes, and I would have agreed to stay in North Carolina for as long as they wanted. But the Margaret holding the phone today was dead to that manipulation. I gripped the phone tighter, feeling the plastic dig into my palm. The anger didn't explode. Instead, it crystallized into a strange, icy calm. I didn't ask about the heater. I didn't ask how much they needed. I didn't offer a single word of comfort for David's fake insomnia. I kept my voice flat, emotionless, and dry. I told her that I was actually very busy enjoying my vacation, and I simply did not have the time or the energy to worry about household trivialities right now. As for the money, I lied with the smoothness that surprised even me. I told her I had left my secure banking token at home, and there was absolutely no way for me to access the funds until I returned. I heard the silence on the other end of the line. It was a stunned, heavy silence. They hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't scripted a response for a mother who said no. Before Jessica could stutter out a rebuttal or try a different angle of guilt, I said I was tired and hung up. I pressed the red button hard. The line went dead. For the first time in my entire life, I was the one who ended the call with my son. My hand was trembling as I put the phone down, but inside a fire was starting to burn. I had just laid the first brick of my fortress. I had said no. I could not sit in the dark of Arthur's guest room for 1 second longer. The image of strangers walking in and out of my front door, treating my sanctuary like a public market, made the blood in my veins boil hotter than lava. It was a physical sensation, a burning heat that started in the pit of my stomach and radiated out to my fingertips. I grabbed my coat, not even pausing to say a proper goodbye or thank you to Arthur. I just needed to be there. My feet carried me across the street with a speed I didn't know I still possessed. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a painful rhythmic thud that echoed in my ears. But the fear that had paralyzed me earlier was gone. It had been swallowed whole by a blinding, righteous fury. I clutched my key ring in my hand so tightly, the metal edges bit into my palm. I offered up a silent, desperate prayer that they hadn't changed the locks on the front door yet. My hand was trembling violently as I jammed the key into the lock. It wasn't from the cold night air. It was from the sheer force of the rage coursing through me. Click. The tumbler turned. The door swung open. The first thing that hit me was not the visual, but the smell. My home, which usually smells of the lavender potpourri I keep on the entryway table, assaulted me with a stench that made me gag. It was a thick, suffocating mix of stale cigarette smoke, cheap, cloying perfume, and the greasy odor of fast food. It smelled dirty. It smelled violated. Loud, thumping bass music was vibrating from the living room, shaking the pictures on the walls. And then I saw them. Right there, in my living room, 3 or 4 strangers were sprawled out on my vintage velvet sofa. They were laughing loudly, their feet, shoes still on, propped up on my coffee table. Beer cans were scattered across my polished oak floors like trash in a gutter. My sacred space, the home I had scrubbed on my hands and knees for decades, looked like a frat house after a party. My sudden appearance in the hallway was like a bomb going off in the room. The laughter died instantly. The music seemed to cut out as someone fumbled for a remote. The strangers stared at me with wide, confused eyes, looking at me as if I were the alien species invading their habitat. David was standing in the corner near the dining hutch, a stack of cash in his hands. When he saw me standing there, his face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. His hands went limp, and the stack of bills fluttered to the floor, scattering like autumn leaves. Jessica stood frozen near the kitchen door. That bright professional hostess smile she had been wearing vanished instantly, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated horror. For a heartbeat, the silence was deafening, broken only by my own ragged, heavy breathing. I didn't hold back. I couldn't. I opened my mouth and a scream tore out of my throat, a sound of pure maternal agony and rage that I didn't recognize as my own voice. I pointed a shaking finger at each of them. I asked them where their consciences had gone. I asked them how they dared to turn their father's house, the home he worked himself into an early grave for, into a brothel. David started to stammer, his eyes darting around the room, trying to weave some clumsy lie about these people just being friends stopping by. I didn't let him finish. I cut him off with a roar. I turned to the strangers on my couch and screamed at them to get out. I told them to get the hell out of my house before I called the police. The panic in the room was instant. The strangers, realizing the gravity of the situation, grabbed their bags and coats, tripping over each other in their haste to escape the wrath of a woman scorned. They fled out the front door, leaving the front door wide open behind them. When the door finally clicked shut behind the last intruder, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew heavy and sharp. This was the moment Jessica decided to drop the act. The mask of the sweet, caring daughter-in-law dissolved, revealing something hard and ugly underneath. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was defiant. She crossed her arms over her chest and glared at me with a brazenness that sent a shiver down my spine. She started yelling, her voice shrill and piercing. She called me an old hoarder. She called me selfish. She said I was a stubborn old woman clutching onto a giant, empty house while my children were drowning in debt. She pointed at the walls and screamed that this house was a dead asset. She said they were just being smart, that they were leveraging the property to save the family economy since I was too old and useless to contribute. Her words were like serrated knives slicing through my heart. There was no remorse in her eyes, only anger that I had ruined their scheme. I looked at David. I wanted him to defend me. I wanted my son to step up and tell his wife to stop speaking to his mother that way. But he just stood there, staring at his shoes, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. He let her humiliate me. He let her strip away my dignity piece by piece. The breaking point came when Jessica stepped closer, her face twisted into a sneer, and hissed that I was old and senile anyway. She said it was only a matter of time before I ended up in a nursing home, so the property was going to be theirs eventually regardless. Why shouldn't they enjoy the inheritance now? That sentence was the drop of water that made the glass overflow. It shattered whatever fragile remnants of motherly instinct I had left holding me back. I pointed to the door, my voice cracking but iron hard, and I told them both to get out. Tonight. Now. I told them I would rather rot alone in this big house than spend another minute breathing the same air as monsters wearing the faces of my family. As the reality of my order sank in, David finally moved. He looked at the mess left behind by his paying customers, the beer cans, the moved furniture, and then he looked at me. He didn't apologize. Instead, he collapsed onto the sofa and started to weep. But these weren't tears of contrition. They were tears of self-pity. He started rambling, a stream of consciousness excuse about a $30,000 debt he had accrued from a bad investments. He talked about the pressure, about needing fast cash to pay off people who were threatening him. He tried to spin it so that turning my home into a motel was a temporary solution, a desperate measure to save himself, as if that justified lying to me and kicking me out. He claimed he never meant to hurt me. I listened to him blubber, and my heart felt like a stone in my chest. He wasn't thinking about how it felt for me to be deceived. He wasn't thinking about the violation of my privacy. He was only thinking about himself. He was using his financial incompetence as a shield, hoping I would do what I had always done, bail him out. He wanted me to soften, to write a check, to hug him and tell him it would be okay. But looking at the way he had conspired with his wife to ship me off to North Carolina, I saw the truth. His cowardice was more dangerous than Jessica's malice. He had sold his mother down the river because he was too weak to clean up his own messes. When Jessica saw that David's tears were hitting a wall of ice, she laughed. It was a dry, bitter sound that had no humor in it. She stepped forward, physically shoving David aside as if he were a piece of broken furniture. She looked at me with eyes that were cold and calculating, like a shark sensing blood in the water. She stopped pretending. She screamed that I was an archaic relic. She told me I didn't understand the modern world. She shouted that their little business venture was bringing in 10 times what my pathetic Social Security check provided. She actually had the nerve to say I should be grateful to them for finally making this dusty old museum valuable. I stood there, stunned into silence by the sheer magnitude of her greed. In her eyes, I wasn't a person. I was an obstacle to cash flow. This house wasn't a home. It was square footage to be monetized. The greed had eaten away at her humanity so completely that she genuinely didn't see the moral problem with turning her mother-in-law's bedroom into a rental unit. My hands were shaking as I walked over to the dining table. There, amidst the chaos, lay a notebook they hadn't had time to hide. I picked it up. It was a ledger. I flipped it open and thrust it toward them. The pages were filled with handwriting I recognized as Jessica's. It was a detailed log of their betrayal, dates, times, check-in amounts, and there, written in black and white, was the listing for the presidential suite. That was my bedroom, my sanctuary, the room where my husband died. They were selling it to strangers for $200 a night. The dates went back a month. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. They had been planning this while sitting at my dinner table, smiling and eating my food. They had been plotting to displace me long before they bought that bus ticket. I slammed the notebook down on the table with a force that made David jump. I pointed at the pile of dirty money on the floor. I asked them if that cash could buy back the honor of this family. I asked them if it could buy peace for their father's soul. I turned to Jessica and asked her if she felt even a flicker of disgust when she led strange men into her father-in-law's bedroom. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. They couldn't answer. The evidence was right there, staring them in the face. I didn't need a confession. The ledger spoke louder than any apology they could offer. The explosive anger began to ebb, leaving behind a deep, numbing ache. I looked at David, the boy I had nursed through fevers, the boy I had walked to school. He looked like a stranger to me now. I spoke to him, my voice trembling with tears I refused to let fall. I told him that I could forgive him for losing money. I could forgive him for failing in his career. Parents forgive those things. But I told him I could never, ever forgive him for selling my trust. I described to him exactly how it felt to sit in the dark across the street and watch the lights go on for strangers. I told him about the pain of realizing I had no rights in my own home. I saw a flicker of shame in David's eyes, but he looked away. Jessica just stood there, chin raised, unrepentant. I realized then that I had lost him. He was gone, consumed by his wife's ambition and his own weakness. That realization broke my heart, but it also clarified my mind. I knew what I had to do to survive. I took a deep breath and stood as tall as my old spine would allow. I channeled every ounce of authority I had as the matriarch of this house. I pointed to the front door, where the darkness of the night waited. "Get out," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was final. I told them to take their trash, their bags, and their schemes, and leave my property immediately. David opened his mouth to beg, to start another round of excuses, but I glared at him with such intensity that his words died in his throat. I told them I didn't want to hear it. Trust is like a mirror. Once it's shattered, you can't put it back together without cutting yourself. I turned my gaze to Jessica and laid down the law. I told them they were not allowed to step foot on this property again without my express permission. I told them I was calling a locksmith first thing in the morning. I told them if they came back to harass me, I would call the police and have them removed for trespassing. The seriousness in my tone finally broke through their arrogance. They realized I wasn't playing games. They saw that the doormat mother was gone. Panic set in. They started grabbing their coats and bags, scooping up the loose cash from the floor, scrambling like rats when the lights turn on. I stood there, immobile, watching their every move until they crossed the threshold. But it wasn't over yet. When they reached the driveway, Jessica spun around. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred. She wasn't going to go quietly. She screamed from the yard, her voice echoing off the neighbors' houses. She shouted that I should wait and see. She yelled that I had no right to kick them out, that the law protected tenants, even if they didn't pay rent. She threatened to sue me. She threatened to drag my name through the mud and tell everyone I was an abusive, senile old woman. Lights flickered on in the houses next door. Neighbors were watching. David grabbed her arm, trying to drag her toward their car, but he looked back at me with eyes that blamed me for the scene. Jessica's threat was a cold splash of water. It was a reminder that this war was just beginning. They wouldn't give up the golden goose easily. But I didn't flinch. I slammed the heavy oak door in their faces. I threw the deadbolt. Then I engaged the chain lock. The sound of the locks clicking into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It sounded like the end of a life. I leaned my back against the door and slowly slid down until I was sitting on the cold floor. The house was silent again, but it was a terrifying silence. The smell of the intruder still hung in the air, a lingering reminder of the violation. I looked around my living room. A coaster had been kicked under the table. A stain marred the rug. My home felt dirty. It felt foreign. I pulled my knees up to my chest and finally let the tears come. I didn't cry because I was scared of their threats. I cried because of the profound loss. I had saved my house, but I had lost my family. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked on, steady and indifferent. Tick, tock, tick, tock. I knew this was going to be the longest night of my life. but at least I was crying on my own floor, behind my own locked door. I wiped my face. I couldn't sit here forever. I had to get up. I had to clean. I needed to scrub every inch of this floor with bleach until the smell of their betrayal was gone. Tomorrow, the sun would rise, and I would need to be stronger than I have ever been before. As soon as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind David and Jessica, sealing out their angry voices and the cool night air, you might think I collapsed into a heap of tears. But I did not. There was no time for weeping, not when my sanctuary had been breached so easily. My first action was to march to the kitchen phone and dial the number for a 24-hour emergency locksmith. It was nearly midnight, and I knew the after-hour service fee would be triple the normal rate, likely costing me a small fortune, but I did not hesitate for a second. When the locksmith arrived 40 minutes later, a burly man with a kind face and a heavy tool belt, the sound of his power drill tearing into my doorframe echoed through the silent house. To anyone else, that screeching metal sound might have been grating, but to me, it was the sweetest melody I had ever heard. It was the sound of severance. It was the sound of me taking back the reins of my life. I had him replace every single lock in the house, the front door, the back slider, and even the side door to the garage. I insisted on high-security deadbolts, the kind that pickpockets and old spare keys could never bypass. I stood there in the hallway, arms crossed over my chest, supervising every screw being tightened. I watched as the old brass locks, the ones David had keys to, the ones he had likely copied for his guests, clattered onto the hardwood floor. With every thud of metal hitting wood, I felt a phantom weight lift off my shoulders. I even made the locksmith change the lock on the master bedroom door, the room where my husband and I had shared a life, the room that had started this entire nightmare. When the job was done, the locksmith handed me a set of heavy, shiny new keys. The cold metal pressed against my palm, grounding me. The chill of the steel seeped into my skin, making me feel alert and sharp. This was not just a home improvement project. This was a declaration of sovereignty. From this night forward, I was the only gatekeeper. I alone would decide who crossed the threshold into my world, and more importantly, who would remain locked out in the cold. The next morning, the sun had barely crested the horizon when I pulled into the parking lot of the local hardware store. Usually, when I come here, I am browsing for potting soil or maybe new curtains. Today, I walked past the garden center without a glance and headed straight for the security aisle. I purchased a top-of-the-line smart surveillance system, the kind that connects directly to your tablet and phone. I needed to see everything. I wanted eyes on the front porch, the backyard pathway, and specifically that side window I had been forced to peek through from Arthur's house. I spent the entire morning on a ladder, wrestling with drills and wires. I am not a young woman, and climbing up and down with a tool belt is not how I usually spend my Tuesdays. My back ached, and sweat soaked through my blouse, but I did not feel tired. The physical exertion was a blessing. It kept my mind from spiraling into the emotional abyss that was waiting for me. By noon, the system was safe. I sat at my kitchen table with my tablet, staring at the screen. My house appeared in high definition from 4 different angles. I could see the mailman walking up the path. I could see a squirrel darting across the lawn. I now had electronic eyes that never blinked and never slept. If David or Jessica dared to drive down this street, if they even thought about parking in my driveway to harass me, I would know before they even turned off their engine. A profound sense of control washed over me. I was no longer the passive old lady sitting in the dark, waiting for the wolf to blow the house down. I had reinforced the walls. I had turned my home into a fortress, a place where I could breathe without looking over my shoulder. Leaving the hardware store, I drove straight to the bank. This was the step I had been dreading, the one that would make the separation official in a way that locks never could. I sat across from the bank manager, a woman I have known for years, and asked for a full audit of my accounts. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice as we went through the transaction history. There they were, dozens of small withdrawals made with the supplementary card I had given David. He had told me he needed the card to pick up my prescriptions or buy groceries for the house. But the statements told a different story. Liquor stores, sports bars, cash withdrawals at casinos. He had been siphoning off my retirement, nickel and dime at a time, funding his vices while telling me he was taking care of me. I took a deep breath, picked up the pen, and signed the paperwork to revoke his access. I canceled his card. I removed him as a joint signer on my savings account. I changed every PIN and every online password to things he would never guess. I didn't stop there. I had the manager double-check to ensure there were no financial power of attorney documents on file. Thank God, there were none. I knew my son and his wife were drowning in debt, and desperate people do desperate things. Cutting off this financial lifeline was a blow I had to strike, not to hurt them, but to ensure I didn't end up destitute in my final years. Walking out of that bank with a new passbook that bore only my name, I felt a strange mix of lightness and hollowness. The financial umbilical cord was cut. I was no longer his banker. I was just his mother. And right now, an estranged one at that. My next stop was Sarah's law office. This wasn't a social call for tea and gossip. I walked in as a client under siege. I laid everything out on her mahogany desk, the ledger I had confiscated from the dining table, the photos I had taken of the strangers in my living room, and the notebook detailing their illegal rental income. Sarah's face hardened as she reviewed the evidence. She was furious on my behalf. We immediately began drafting the paperwork for a temporary restraining order. If they showed up to bang on my door or scream threats from the sidewalk again, I wanted the legal authority to have them removed instantly. But we didn't stop there. I revoked the medical power of attorney I had signed years ago, the one that would have given David the right to make health decisions for me if I became incapacitated. A shiver ran down my spine as I thought about the fake doctor's note I had heard Jessica threaten me with, the one claiming I was senile. If I didn't strip them of this power, my freedom and my very life could be in their hands. Sarah also helped me redraft my last will and testament. This was the hardest signature of the day. With a steady hand, I drew a line through David's name. He was removed as the beneficiary. Instead, I designated my assets to a local charity that helps homeless seniors and set aside a trust for the perpetual care of my husband's grave. Signing that document wasn't about punishment or spite. It was about justice. It was about ensuring that the fruits of my life's labor would not go to those who had treated me with such contempt. I returned home in the late afternoon to face the physical remnants of their presence. The house was secure, but it was still cluttered with their things. Jessica's expensive cosmetics were scattered across the bathroom vanity. David's video game consoles were piled by the television. Her clothes were draped over chairs. His shoes were kicked into corners. Every object was a memory, a trigger of the happy family I thought I had, but now they just looked like garbage polluting my space. I didn't throw them out on the lawn. I didn't burn them. I refused to give them the satisfaction of calling me crazy or destructive. I wanted to be above reproach. I retrieved a stack of large cardboard boxes from the garage and began to pack. I worked methodically, like a machine. I folded the shirts I used to iron for my son, and I didn't shed a tear. I wrapped Jessica's perfume bottles in newspaper, and I didn't feel a spike of anger. I simply wanted them gone. I taped every box shut, sealing the past inside, and wrote David's name on the outside in the thick black marker. I called a courier service and paid to have everything shipped to the address of the small rental storage unit I knew David used for his failed business inventory. Sending these boxes away was a cleansing ritual. It was like scrubbing a stain out of a carpet. With every box that was carried out the door, the air in my house became a little lighter, a little purer. That evening, the digital assault began. My phone started buzzing on the counter and didn't stop. There were dozens of missed calls. A barrage of text messages flooded in from David, from Jessica, and even from numbers I didn't recognize, likely the guests who were angry that their reservations had been canceled. The messages started out pleading. David sent texts begging me to be reasonable, playing the victim, crying about how much trouble they were in. When I didn't reply, the tone shifted. Jessica's texts were vile, filled with curses, accusations, and threats. She called me a cruel mother, a heartless witch who was ruining her son's life. I read a few lines and felt my heart turn to stone. There was no remorse in those words, only the panic of parasites who had lost their host. I didn't type a reply. I didn't engage. Instead, I went into my phone settings and systematically blocked every single number. I blocked them on Facebook. I blocked them on email. I cut every digital thread that connected us. I didn't want their poison seeping into my mind for 1 second longer. I also reset my home Wi-Fi password, the one Jessica had so generously taped to the refrigerator for her paying customers. When I was done, the phone finally fell silent. The house was quiet. It wasn't a lonely silence. It was the peaceful silence of freedom. I had disconnected from the toxicity, and in doing so, I had reconnected with my own peace of mind. The final layer of my defense system was the most human one. The next morning, I baked a fresh batch of oatmeal raisin cookies and walked over to Arthur's house. Then I visited Mrs. Johnson next door and Mr. Miller down the street. I didn't air all my dirty laundry. I didn't tell them every shameful detail of what my son had done. But I told them, clearly and firmly, that David and Jessica no longer lived with me and were not welcome on the premises. I asked them, as neighbors and friends, to keep an eye out. I asked them to call the police immediately if they saw anyone lurking around my property or trying to break in while I was out. The response was overwhelming. They looked at me with knowing, sympathetic eyes. They had seen the strange cars coming and going all week. They had suspected something was wrong. Arthur patted my shoulder and promised he would sit on his porch and keep watch every evening. Mrs. Johnson hugged me and said she had my back. I realized then that I had a safety net I hadn't fully appreciated. These people, my neighbors, were a human wall of protection. They were my community, a family not of blood, but of kindness. Knowing they were watching out for me made me feel safer than any camera system ever could. 3 days after the confrontation, I finally sat down in my favorite armchair in the living room. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow across the floorboards. The house was spotless. The air smelled of fresh lemongrass and lemon polish, erasing the stale odor of cigarettes and beer. The doors were bolted tight. The cameras were recording. My money was safe. My will was updated. The silence was filled only by the soft, soulful notes of a jazz record my husband used to love, spinning gently on the turntable. I looked around the room, and for the first time in months, I felt like the true mistress of this house. I wasn't walking on eggshells anymore. I wasn't worrying about pleasing a daughter-in-law who despised me or protecting a son who used me. There was a deep ache in my heart, the kind that comes from severing a limb to save the body. But underneath that pain was a bedrock of strength. I am older now, yes, but I am not weak. I have built my fortress. I have reclaimed my dignity. And as the music played on, I knew I was ready to live out the rest of my days on my own terms, protecting my husband's legacy and my own peace. The morning after the storm, I sat by the window, staring out at the empty yard. My body felt heavy, drained by the adrenaline crash of the night before. The house was silent. No intruders, no music, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. I flinched, my eyes darting immediately to the security monitor I had installed on the kitchen counter, my heart leaping into my throat. I was terrified it was David coming back to beg, or worse, Jessica coming back to scream. But the screen showed a familiar, stooped figure standing on the porch. It was Arthur. He was holding a large ceramic pot covered with a tea towel, steam rising gently into the crisp morning air, and his face wore a look of deep, wrinkled concern. I opened the door, and instantly the rich, savory aroma of Southern-style chicken vegetable soup drifted in, pushing away the lingering coldness of the house. Arthur didn't say much. He didn't need to. "I saw your lights on all night, Margaret," he said, his voice gravelly but gentle. "Figured you hadn't eaten. You need your strength." We sat opposite each other in my kitchen, the morning sun slanting across the table. Arthur ladled the soup into bowls, his movements slow and deliberate, like a big brother taking care of a scraped knee. He had seen everything from his window last night: the police threat, the screaming, the departure. But he didn't pry. He didn't ask, "How could they do this?" or "Why didn't you see it coming?" He didn't offer judgment on my son. He simply offered his presence. There is a profound understanding among us older folks, a silent language born of weathering life's storms. As I swallowed the first spoonful of hot broth, tears pricked my eyes again. But these weren't tears of betrayal. They were tears of relief. I realized in that moment that this neighbor, a man I had only exchanged pleasantries with over the fence for years, cared more about whether I was fed and warm than the boy I had birthed and raised. The soup wasn't just food, it was dignity served in a bowl. It was a reminder that I was still a person worth caring for. By afternoon, the cavalry arrived in the form of a silver sedan pulling sharply into my driveway. Sarah stepped out, clutching a thick manila folder, her stride as confident as ever. Sarah isn't just the best lawyer in our county. She has been my friend since we were girls with frizzy hair and big dreams. When she walked through the door and saw my puffy, red-rimmed eyes, she didn't waste time with hollow platitudes like, "It's going to be okay." She dropped her briefcase, walked straight to me, and pulled me into a fierce, solid hug. "We are not going to let them bully you, Margaret," she whispered fiercely into my ear. "Not on my watch, never." We sat at the dining table, the same table where I had found that hateful ledger, and Sarah laid out her strategy. She spoke the language of the law, but her tone was that of a guardian. She explained the restraining order process in detail, assuring me that Jessica's threats of suing for tenant rights were largely hot air given the evidence of elder abuse and illegal business practices we had. She told me she had already made a few discreet calls to friends on the city council to flag the unauthorized commercial use of a residential property, effectively cutting off their ability to rent it out ever again. As I watched her flip through pages, highlighting clauses and outlining defenses, I felt like I was being fitted for a suit of armor. Sarah's sharpness, her legal precision, was the steel I needed to reinforce my own soft heart. She showed me that justice isn't just a concept in a book. It lives in the actions of friends who stand up for you when you can't stand alone. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, the three of us, Arthur, Sarah, and I, found ourselves sitting out on my front porch. We held mugs of hot tea, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. The air was cool, but the atmosphere was incredibly warm. It was so different from the chaotic, fake energy David and Jessica had brought into this house. We talked about the old days, about the changes in the town, about how our joints ached when it rained. Sarah laughed her loud, infectious laugh, and Arthur cracked dry jokes that made us smile. For the first time in months, the knot of anxiety in my chest uncoiled completely. Looking at my two old friends, a simple but powerful truth settled over me. Family isn't just about bloodlines or DNA. It isn't about who you gave birth to or who shares your last name. Real family are the people who bring you soup when you're starving for kindness. They are the ones who use their skills to fight for your honor when you've been humiliated. They are the ones willing to sit with you in the dark silence without asking for a single thing in return. David and Jessica might be my biological kin, but Arthur and Sarah, they were the true family of my soul. The terrified loneliness I had feared when I chased my children away didn't happen. Instead, sitting there on my porch, surrounded by loyalty and respect, I felt more connected, more loved, and more valued than I had in years. My dear friends listening out there, have you ever had a moment where a stranger treated you with more kindness than your own flesh and blood? If you have a friend like Sarah or a neighbor like Arthur who has been your rock, I want you to honor them right now. Type the word soulmate in the comments below. Let's celebrate the family we choose, because true connection is the most precious thing we have. 3 days after I purged my house of David and Jessica, I turned my attention to the final frontier, the dilapidated shed in the corner of the backyard. For decades, this was my husband's domain, a place of sawdust and engine grease where he fixed everything from toasters to lawnmowers. But for the last few years, David had claimed it. He put a heavy padlock on the door, told me he was storing sensitive business documents, and strictly forbade me from going near it. He acted like it was the Pentagon. But today, armed with the shiny new master key the locksmith had cut for me, I walked across the grass toward that rotting wooden door with a feeling that was equal parts curiosity and dread. The door protested with a dry, screeching groan as I pushed it open, revealing a space that was dark, damp, and smelled of mildew and secrets. I switched on the flashlight app on my phone, the beam cutting through the dust motes dancing in the stale air. The space was crammed with the cardboard boxes stacked precariously high. On the outside, someone had scrawled harmless labels in black marker, old invoices, tax returns 2018, books. It looked boring. It looked innocent. But my gut, that same maternal instinct that had warned me about the trip to North Carolina, was screaming that something was wrong. Why would a lazy boy like David, who couldn't be bothered to hang up a towel, be so meticulous about storing old paper? I pulled on a pair of yellow rubber gloves and started pulling the boxes down. I wasn't looking for clutter. I was looking for the truth behind the knot in my stomach. I spent nearly an hour in that suffocating heat, sweat trickling down my back, sifting through meaningless papers. Then, at the bottom of a box allegedly containing old clothes, my hand struck something hard and cold. I pulled it out. It was a heavy, gray metal cash box, the kind you see at garage sales or school fundraisers, secured with a combination lock. I stared at the dials. I tried David's birthday first. Nothing. I tried his wedding anniversary. Still locked. Then I paused. I thought about Jessica and her obsession with money, her constant complaints about their finances. I remembered the specific number David had cried about that night in my living room. I spun the dials. 3000. Click. The latch sprang open. I lifted the lid, and my breath caught in my throat. The first thing I saw was money. Stacks of it. Rubber-banded bundles of 20s and 50s filled the tray. I did a quick count. It had to be at least $10,000. This was the profit they had been skimming off my house, the money they claimed they didn't have while begging me for loans. But the cash was just the surface. Underneath the tray lay a document that made my heart stop beating for a second. It was a long-term residential lease agreement, fully drafted and ready to sign. My eyes scanned the page. Under the section titled Property Owner, the name Margaret had been deleted. In its place, typed in bold letters, was David and Jessica. And at the bottom, a small italicized footnote read, Legal ownership transfer in progress, judicial proceedings pending. They weren't just using my house, they had already written me out of it. To them, I was just a clerical error waiting to be corrected. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the box as I dug deeper. A pale blue medical folder slid out next. The label on the front read, Dr. Peterson's Psychiatric Clinic. I frowned. I have never heard of a Dr. Peterson. I have never seen a psychiatrist in my life. I opened the folder, and the words inside danced before my eyes like demons. It was a complete medical evaluation under my name. Patient, Margaret, age, 64. Preliminary diagnosis, progressive cognitive decline. Symptoms, memory loss, paranoia, inability to make financial decisions or perform self-care. Recommendation, immediate appointment of a legal guardian. I felt like my chest was going to explode with a mixture of rage and nausea. This was a complete fabrication. A lie. They had constructed a perfect narrative to paint me, a healthy, sharp-minded woman, as a senile, incompetent old lady in the eyes of the law. This explained the whispers. This explained the fake pity in Jessica's eyes when we were around other people. They were gaslighting me, building a paper trail to strip me of my human rights so they could legally steal my home. But the horror wasn't over. Tucked at the very bottom of the box was a small spiral-bound notebook. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Jessica's, neat, sharp, and predatory. The page was dog-eared and marked with a red pen. The header read, Friday Plan. I read the bullet points, and my blood ran cold. 1. Dr. Peterson agreed to certify condition. Facilitation fee, $5,000. 2. Mix mild sedative into evening tea before signing power of attorney. Reason, help mom sleep. 3. Contact Golden Hope Nursing Facility. Economy package, $3,000 month. Stapled to the page was a glossy brochure for Golden Hope. Jessica had circled the text in red ink. 24-hour secure lockdown. For memory care patients, complete isolation for treatment. I gagged. I actually gagged. They weren't just planning to take my money. They were planning to drug me. That cup of chamomile tea Jessica brought me every night with a sweet smile. Dear God, how many doses had I already swallowed? They were going to sedate me, trick me into signing away my freedom, and then dump me in a cheap warehouse for the dying, where I would rot alone until I stopped breathing. They wanted to bury me alive. I slammed the metal box shut, leaning against the workbench to keep from collapsing. The pain of betrayal was gone, replaced by a terrifying, crystal-clear clarity. The fog of motherly love evaporated instantly. I wasn't looking at the mistakes of a wayward son anymore. I was looking at the evidence of a crime. These were not my children. They were predators who had been hunting me in my own home. I pulled out my phone. My hands were steady now, fueled by a survival instinct I didn't know I possessed. I took photos of everything. I photographed the cash, the fake lease, the forged medical report, and every damning line of Jessica's notebook. I made sure every image was sharp and legible. Then, I gathered the original documents, shoved them into a plastic bag, and hid them inside my coat. I walked straight to my car, locked the doors, and drove directly to Sarah's office. When I walked in and placed that plastic bag on her desk, Sarah opened it. I watched her face go from confusion to shock, and finally to a look of steely resolve. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous. "This isn't just defense anymore, Margaret. This is the smoking gun. This is the weapon we use to end this once and for all." With that metal box in my possession, the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the victim. I held the keys to their destruction, and I was ready to turn the lock. I left Sarah's law office just as the afternoon sun began to dip low in the sky, painting the horizon in bruised shades of purple and orange. I didn't intend to go there, but my car seemed to have a mind of its own, guiding me down the familiar winding roads to the old cemetery on the hill. This is where my husband rests, my partner, my best friend, the other half of my soul. I parked the car and walked down the gravel path, the small stones crunching softly under my sensible shoes. The wind was picking up, rustling through the leaves of the ancient oak trees that stand guard over the graves, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and rain. It should have felt cold, but strangely, I felt a warmth wrapping around me, as if I were walking back into his embrace. I sat down on the grass beside the gray marble headstone, the stone cool and smooth against my palm as I traced the letters of his name. All the exhaustion of the last few days, the adrenaline of the confrontation, the sheer physical revulsion of holding those criminal documents, it all came crashing down on me right there. I leaned my forehead against the cold stone and finally let go. "Hey, honey," I whispered, my voice thick and cracking. "Can you see what they are doing to us? Can you see what they have done to our home?" I didn't need to speak the words out loud. I told him everything in the silent language we always shared. I told him about the betrayal. I told him about the plot to lock me away in a nursing home. I told him about David. That was the hardest part. I told him how the boy he taught to throw a baseball, the boy he taught to shake hands like a gentleman, had turned into a weak, conniving man who would sell his own mother for a quick buck. My tears fell onto the grass, hot and salty, watering the earth that held him. In that sacred silence, I closed my eyes, and I could almost hear his deep rumble of a laugh echoing in the wind. Memories flooded back, washing over me. I remembered the lean years, back when we first bought that house. I remembered his hands, rough, calloused, stained with grease and cement dust, working tirelessly to fix the leaky roof or patch the drywall. I remembered a specific night during a terrible storm. We were huddled in the living room with buckets catching drips wrapped in blankets. He looked at me then, his eyes fierce and loving, and he said, "Margaret, this house isn't just bricks and wood. It is my promise to you. It is my promise that no matter how hard the world gets out there, you and the kids will always have a safe place to lay your heads." That promise was the foundation of my life. He had worked himself to the bone, sacrificing his own comfort, his own dreams just to keep that roof over our heads. And now I had almost let it slip away into the hands of greed. A wave of guilt washed over me, heavy and suffocating. Was this my fault? Had I been too soft on David after his father died? Did I spoil him, shielding him from the harsh realities of work, creating this monster who thinks the world owes him a living? I buried my face in my hands, feeling small and unworthy. I felt like I had failed to protect the one thing he left me. I had let our sanctuary be defiled by strangers and lies. But then, a sudden strong gust of wind swept through the cemetery. It shook the white daisies I had placed in the vase, making them dance wildly. It felt like a hand on my shoulder. I snapped my head up. I wiped my eyes. I remembered the look in my husband's eyes when he faced a challenge. He never wallowed. He never surrendered. He was a warrior in his own quiet way. If he were here right now, he wouldn't be sitting on the grass crying. He would be standing up. He would be rolling up his sleeves. He would be marching down that hill to throw out anyone who dared to threaten his family. The image of him standing tall on our front porch, guarding us, burned in my mind. He had passed me the torch. He had trusted me to keep the flame burning, and I had almost let it go out. My weakness wasn't just sadness. It was an insult to his memory. I looked up at the darkening sky, and I felt something shift inside me. The sorrow didn't disappear, but it hardened. It cooled and solidified into something resembling steel. I wasn't just fighting for my own comfort or my own retirement anymore. I was fighting for his honor. I was fighting to preserve the moral code he lived and died by. I stood up slowly, my knees popping, and brushed the dirt from my skirt. My legs felt steady. The trembling was gone. I placed my hand on top of the headstone one last time, not to seek comfort, but to make a vow. "I'm sorry I let you down," I said, my voice clear and carrying on the wind. "But I promise you this. From this moment on, I will be the guardian this house deserves. No one, absolutely no one, is going to take it from us or dirty it ever again." I turned and walked back toward my car. I walked with a different rhythm now, with the stride of a soldier going to the front lines. In my pocket, I had the evidence to destroy their schemes. But in my heart, I had something far more powerful, the ferocious love of a wife protecting her husband's legacy. David and Jessica might have the tricks, the greed, and the ruthlessness, but they didn't have what I had. They didn't have righteousness, and they didn't have the ancestors watching over them. I started the engine and drove back toward the city lights, I was ready for the final battle. I would not yield. That house is his blood and sweat, and I will defend it with every breath left in my body. Friday morning arrived with a sky so gray and heavy it looked ready to collapse onto the city roofs. I was sitting in my living room, nursing a cup of ginger tea to settle a stomach that was churning with anxiety, when the sound came. It wasn't the frantic, demanding doorbell ringing of Jessica, nor was it the polite, rhythmic knock of Arthur. This was different. It was a sharp, authoritative rap on the wood, the kind of knock that doesn't ask for permission but demands compliance. My heart skipped a beat, then started racing. I glanced at the security monitor on the counter. Standing on my porch was a middle-aged woman in a severe gray suit, clutching a thick file, flanked by a uniformed police officer. And lurking behind them, wearing expressions of staged heartbreak that made me want to vomit, were David and Jessica. I knew this moment was coming. In that little black notebook of Jessica's that I had found in the shed, today's date was circled in red ink next to the words, Execution Day. But even with all my preparation, seeing the police on my doorstep made my hands tremble. For a black woman of my generation, who has lived a life of quiet, law-abiding dignity, the presence of law enforcement always brings a cold, invisible fear. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed down the front of my blouse, and lifted my chin. I am not a criminal. I am the homeowner, and I refuse to let them see me sweat, not even for a second. I walked over and opened the door. The woman in the gray suit didn't smile. She introduced herself as Mrs. Clark from Adult Protective Services, APS. Her eyes swept over me with a cold, clinical detachment, the kind of look used to assess a piece of damaged furniture, not a human being. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She informed me that her agency had received an emergency report alleging that I was living in unsafe conditions, exhibiting signs of severe dementia, paranoia, and violent behavior toward my family. Specifically, the report claimed I had lost control of my faculties and had thrown my children out onto the street in a delirious fit of confusion. I stood there, frozen. Each accusation felt like a poison-tipped needle pricking my skin. They weren't just coming for my house anymore. They were coming for my mind. They were trying to assassinate my character, to paint me as a senile, dangerous old woman in the eyes of the state. I looked past Mrs. Clark to see Jessica dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief, playing the role of the devastated daughter-in-law to perfection. David wouldn't even look at me. He kept his head down, mumbling to the officer, "Mom has been forgetting everything lately. She even almost burned the house down because she forgot the gas stove was on." The lie was so blatant it nearly choked me. I have never left a stove on in my life. They were the ones who left messes. They were the ones who were careless. But in this moment, his lie was their truth. Mrs. Clark stated that she needed to enter the premises to conduct an immediate welfare check and environmental assessment. I knew I couldn't refuse without looking uncooperative, so I stepped aside. She marched into my living room, opening her thick file and clicking her pen. Then began the humiliation. She started asking me the kind of questions you would ask a toddler or someone who had just suffered a head injury. "Do you know what day it is, Margaret? Can you tell me who the current president is? Do you know your own full name?" The shame burned in my chest like acid. Here I was, a woman who had managed the payroll and bookkeeping for an entire hospital department for 30 years, being tested on my own name in my own living room. I wanted to scream, but I knew an outburst would only prove their point. I forced myself to remain calm. I answered every question clearly, looking Mrs. Clark dead in the eye. but Jessica wouldn't let me finish a sentence. She kept interjecting, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Oh, Mom, don't strain yourself. You'll get a headache again," she cooed, then leaned in to whisper loudly to Mrs. Clark. "You see, she's trying so hard to mask it, but she'll forget everything in 10 minutes. Yesterday, she didn't even recognize me." It was gaslighting in its purest, most evil form. She was trying to make my very sanity look like a symptom of denial. After doing a lap around the house, Mrs. Clark returned to the living room, her expression grave. She told me that while I appeared lucid at this exact moment, based on the preliminary medical history provided by my family, my condition was likely volatile and dangerous. On cue, Jessica reached into her designer bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the forged medical report from Dr. Peterson, the one I had seen in the shed. "We managed to get an emergency appointment with Dr. Peterson this afternoon," Jessica said, sounding so concerned it was terrifying. "He's a leading specialist. He can help get Mom admitted for the best treatment. The ambulance is already waiting outside." Ambulance? My blood ran cold. I looked out the front window. Sure enough, parked right behind the police cruiser was a white van with flashing lights. They hadn't just called a doctor, they had arranged a transport. They intended to take me right now. This wasn't a medical appointment. It was a kidnapping sanctioned by bureaucracy. I realized with horrifying clarity that if I stepped foot in that ambulance, I would be taken straight to the Golden Hope nursing facility, sedated and locked away. I would never see the sun as a free woman again. The walls were closing in. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I am not going anywhere," I said, my voice tight but firm. Mrs. Clark frowned, her demeanor shifting from clinical to stern. "Mrs. Margaret, if you refuse necessary medical care and pose a danger to yourself, we are authorized by law to intervene. This is for your own safety." She started reciting statutes about guardianship, about how my son, as my next of kin, had the legal right to make decisions if I was incapacitated. David finally looked up, his eyes pleading but weak. "Mom, please, just go for the checkup. We only want what's best for you." "What's best for me?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Your definition of best is a prison cell." I gripped the arm of the sofa to stop my hands from shaking. I knew I couldn't physically fight a police officer or a social worker. I had to fight with my mind. I looked straight at Mrs. Clark. "I refuse to be examined by Dr. Peterson," I stated clearly. "I demand to be seen by my own family physician who has treated me for 20 years. And furthermore, I demand that my attorney be present before I answer a single additional question." The mention of an attorney made Mrs. Clark pause. She hadn't expected a senile old woman to know her legal rights so precisely. She blinked, momentarily thrown off her script. Just as the tension in the room threatened to snap, a sound cut through the air like a thunderclap, the sharp rhythmic click-clack of high heels on hardwood. "Nobody is taking my client anywhere without a court order." The voice was booming, authoritative, and utterly magnificent. Sarah swept into the room, her leather briefcase in hand, radiating an energy that instantly shrank everyone else in the space. I had sent her a panic text the second I saw David on the camera, and thank God, she had flown here. Sarah's arrival changed the atmospheric pressure of the room. Jessica's face drained of color, and she took a step back. Mrs. Clark looked at Sarah and realized immediately that she was dealing with a shark, not a guppy. Sarah slammed her briefcase onto the dining table and pulled out a file. My client, Margaret, is fully competent, Sarah declared, her eyes flashing fire. Here is a mental health certificate issued yesterday, by the chief of neurology at City Hospital. That is an independent, state-accredited facility, not some shady private clinic. She put a heavy emphasis on the word shady as she glared at Jessica. Sarah didn't stop there. She snatched the paper Jessica was holding, the Dr. Peterson report, glanced at it, and let out a dry, humorless laugh. Interesting, Sarah said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Mrs. Clark, are you aware that this Dr. Peterson is currently under investigation by the Medical Board for insurance fraud and falsifying patient records? And more importantly, my client has never met the man. How exactly does one diagnose progressive cognitive decline in a patient one has never spoken to? Sarah then reached into her file and pulled out the photos I had taken in the shed. The photos of Jessica's notebook, the red ink detailing the $5,000 bribe. She thrust them toward Mrs. Clark. This is the real truth, Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous. This isn't a case of a senile elder. This is a premeditated conspiracy to commit elder abuse and financial fraud. And those two people standing there, she pointed an accusing finger at David and Jessica, are the perpetrators. Mrs. Clark took the photos. I watched her face transform. The clinical detachment vanished, replaced first by shock and then by a rising flush of anger as she looked from the evidence to my son and daughter-in-law. I stood up then. My legs felt stronger now. I walked over to Mrs. Clark. You want proof of my lost control? I asked quietly. Look at this house. I gestured around the immaculate room. Look at my kitchen. No burns. Look at my garden. Does a demented person maintain a home like this? I pulled out my phone and cast the video from the security camera onto the large TV screen on the wall. It showed the footage from the night I kicked them out. The screen filled with images of the messy living room, the beer cans, the strangers coming in and out, and finally, Jessica screaming threats at me. This is why I threw them out, I said, my voice trembling with the effort to hold back tears. Not because I am crazy, but because they turned my home into an illegal hotel. I evicted them to protect my safety and my dignity. That is the action of a sane mother, Mrs. Clark. Mrs. Clark watched the video in silence. Then she turned slowly to look at David and Jessica. Her eyes were no longer assessing me. They were filled with disdain for them. I think I have seen enough, she said, her voice icy. She turned to the police officer and whispered something in his ear. The officer nodded and stepped toward David. My son shrank back, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. Mr. David, Mrs. Jessica, Mrs. Clark said, her tone officially closing the door on their scheme. Based on this new evidence, I am closing the complaint against Mrs. Margaret as unfounded. However, I am opening an official investigation into filing a false report and attempted elder abuse against both of you. Jessica's jaw dropped. She started to stammer a protest, but the officer raised a hand to silence her. Their perfect plan had collapsed. Outside, the ambulance driver, realizing there was no patient to transport, turned off his flashing lights and drove away. When the door finally closed behind the officials and my ungrateful children, who were being escorted to the station to give statements, I collapsed onto the sofa. My limbs felt like jelly. Sweat was pouring down my back. That psychological battle had drained me more than a week of hard labor. I looked over at Sarah. She gave me a fierce, proud nod. I had won. I had won not just because I had evidence, but because I refused to let fear paralyze me. They had attacked my greatest insecurity, the fear of aging, of being useless, of being forgotten. But I had proven that age does not mean weakness. My mind was sharp, my dignity was intact. No corrupt doctor and no greedy child could take that away from me. I poured myself a fresh cup of tea, my hand shaking only slightly, and felt a wave of immense pride wash over me. This house and this mind still belonged to me. A week after that chaotic affair with Adult Protective Services, the illusion of peace was shattered by a registered mail carrier. He handed me a large manila envelope, the kind that only ever brings bad news, and I had to sign for it. Just holding it, I could feel its weight, not in ounces, but in dread. It felt like it was filled with stones. Inside, of course, was a summons from the civil court. Jessica had made good on her threat. They were suing me. They were suing me for wrongful eviction and demanding $100,000 in damages for their emotional distress. And this was the part that truly took my breath away, for their capital investments in the home. I read those cold, legal words and found myself laughing. It was a dry, brittle sound, but I laughed. Capital investments? Did they mean the cheap locks they put on the doors to keep me out? Or perhaps the paint they used to turn my late husband's study into one of their rental rooms? The audacity, the sheer, shameless nerve of it all, it had moved past any moral boundary I could even recognize. They didn't see me as a mother anymore. I was just a business partner who had broken a contract, someone to be punished and squeezed for every last dime. I set the papers down on the table, right next to my teacup, which had long gone cold. I didn't cry. I think I was all out of tears. All that was left was the quiet, hard resolve of someone who knows they're standing in the path of a speeding train and has no choice but to stand their ground. There was no more running. I brought the summons to Sarah's office. She put on her reading glasses, scanned the documents, and let out a long, weary sigh, shaking her head. "They're playing the victim, Margaret," she explained, her voice tinged with frustration. "Their lawyer is arguing that because David lived with you for over 30 days and supposedly contributed to household expenses, even though it was your money, he qualifies as a legal tenant. By changing the locks and kicking them out without a formal 30-day notice, you technically violated landlord-tenant law." I listened, and the bitterness of it all just settled in my stomach like lead. You try to build a world based on love and family, and they twist it, using laws meant to protect people as weapons to hurt them. Sarah pointed out Jessica's crafty little strategy. She wanted to frame this as a simple, dry housing dispute, completely erasing the abuse, the illegal business, the threats. They were banking on me being afraid of the legal mess, afraid of the cost, and just giving in to make it go away. They had misjudged me completely. I looked Sarah dead in the eye. "I don't care what it costs, Sarah. I want the truth to be heard in court. I want that judge to know exactly what this tenant did to his landlord." 2 days before the court date, their lawyer sent over a settlement offer. Sarah called and read it to me, and I could hear the contempt in her voice even over the phone. They propose to drop the lawsuit on the condition that you allow them to move back into the converted shed, and that you agree to give them 30% of the profits if you sell the house in the future. She paused, taking a breath. Or, as an alternative, you pay them $50,000 in cash immediately so they can stabilize their new life. This time, the laugh that escaped me was sharp and loud. $50,000. This wasn't a settlement. It was extortion, plain and simple. It was a shakedown. Did they truly believe that after everything, after the police, after the APS, after the lies and the theft, that I would just break? That I was still that same lonely old woman, so terrified of being alone that I would pay for a false, toxic peace? This wasn't an olive branch. This was an olive branch dipped in arsenic. If I took it, I would be right back in their web. And the next time, I knew in my bones, the price would be my life. Tell them no, I said, and my voice was so firm it surprised even me. Not 1 cent, not 1 inch of land, no negotiation. I told Sarah to deliver a message back to their lawyer, that I was ready for court, that I was eager to testify publicly. I had nothing left to hide, and the only thing I had left to lose was my dignity, which I wasn't about to sign away. I would rather take that $50,000 and donate it to an orphanage, give it to children who actually needed help, than hand it over to 2 able-bodied, full-grown adults whose souls were so rotten they would prey on their own mother. Making that decision, saying those words out loud, it felt like a weight lifting. It was like finally agreeing to the surgery to cut out a tumor. You know it will be painful. You know the recovery will be hard, but it is the only way to survive. I knew the trial would be agonizing. I knew I would have to sit there and listen to my own son lie about me in front of strangers. I would have to hear Jessica twist the truth into something monstrous. But I accepted it. I wanted David and Jessica to stand before a judge, before the law, and answer for what they did, not hide their crimes behind a quiet, sealed settlement. The night before court, I didn't sleep. But it wasn't the anxious, churning sleeplessness of the weeks before. This was a night of preparation. I went to my closet and pulled out my best suit, the deep navy blue one I had worn to my husband's funeral. It was a suit of dignity, of solemn respect. I took out the iron and pressed it, making sure every crease was sharp as my resolve. When I walked into that courtroom tomorrow, I wanted them to see Margaret, a homeowner, a sane woman, a person of substance and self-respect, not the frail, confused old woman they had tried to paint me as. I sat down at my dining room table and opened the metal box of evidence one last time. The photos of the filthy, chaotic rooms, the little black notebook detailing their illegal business, and most important of all, the piece of paper from the shed, the one detailing the plan to drug me. I ran my fingers over the cold paper. This was my shield. This was my sword. I looked up at the photograph of my husband hanging on the wall. His eyes, so kind in the picture, seemed to be encouraging me, telling me I was strong enough. Tomorrow, I whispered to him, we get justice. Not just for me, Arthur, but for all the mothers and fathers out there who are being taken advantage of simply because they love their children. I turned off the lamp, and I sat there in the quiet, peaceful darkness, waiting for the sun to rise on Judgment Day. The county courthouse was packed that morning. The air in the courtroom was thick, smelling of old wood polish, and a tension so heavy it was hard to breathe. I sat at the defendant's table, my back straight, my hands clasped so tightly on the cold table surface that my knuckles were white. Beside me, Sarah was calmly arranging her thick stack of files, her confidence as absolute and steady as a general's before a battle. Across the aisle, David and Jessica were already seated. They were dressed so respectably it was almost comical. David wore a pitiful gray suit. and Jessica was in a pale cream dress, her makeup applied lightly to look young and innocent. Looking at them playing the role of devoted children abused by their mother made my stomach clench with disgust. They wouldn't look at me. David just stared at his lap, picking at a thread on his slacks, while Jessica would occasionally lift a handkerchief to dab at the corners of her perfectly dry eyes, putting on a show for the judge. Judge Anderson, a black woman about my own age, with stern, horn-rimmed glasses, entered the room. The bailiff called for us to rise. The sharp bang of the wooden gavel echoed through the room. Copped! It was a sound of finality, signaling that the play acting was over and the truth was about to have its day. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the knowledge that this single moment would decide the rest of my life. David and Jessica's lawyer, a slick young man with shifty eyes, started things off. He gave a syrupy opening statement, painting his clients as silent heroes who had sacrificed their youth to move in and care for their difficult and increasingly senile mother. He accused me of being cruel, of violating tenant laws by throwing them out into the cold night without notice, causing them severe emotional distress and leaving them homeless. Then David was called to the witness stand. He started crying almost immediately. This time the tears looked more real, but I knew they were tears of fear of losing, not tears of remorse. He lied, one lie after another. He claimed he had spent his own money on renovations and new locks to make the home safer and more comfortable for me. He claimed the $30,000 of debt he was in was from buying my medications, though I had never asked him for so much as an aspirin. Listening to my own son, my flesh and blood, fabricate such bald-faced lies about me in a public forum, it felt like someone was physically squeezing my heart. But Sarah put her hand on mine under the table and squeezed gently, reminding me to stay strong. I took a deep breath and swallowed the pain. Let him talk. The more he talked, the tighter the trap he was setting for himself became. Then it was Sarah's turn to cross-examine. She walked up to David, her voice perfectly calm, but every question was a scalpel. "Mr. David," she asked, "you claim you are $30,000 in debt from caring for your mother. Can you please explain then the over $10,000 in undeclared cash income we found in your personal safe, located in the shed?" David stammered, his face instantly turning a deep shade of red. He looked at his lawyer, desperate, but there was no help coming. "And you say you renovated the rooms for your mother's comfort?" Sarah continued, pulling out a thick stack of screenshots from the Airbnb website. "Then why was this comfortable room listed for $80 a night, with the description, 'a romantic getaway for couples'?" A murmur went through the courtroom. Judge Anderson frowned, staring intently at David. Sarah didn't let him breathe. She presented the revenue notebook. "Your Honor, this was not a case of children caring for a mother. This was an illegal, unlicensed hotel business being run out of my client's property. And worse, they evicted the actual homeowner to another part of the house to maximize their profits." David just froze on the stand, sweat beading on his forehead. The mask of the filial son was cracking, revealing the greedy opportunist underneath. When Jessica took the stand, her whole demeanor was different. She was hard, brassy, and tried to cover her lies with aggression. She insisted I had agreed to the business to help with the economy and that I had only turned on them because I was getting senile. She had the audacity to say that changing the locks on my bedroom was to ensure the security of their paying guests, a reasonable business decision. Margaret is old. She forgets things. She imagines things. Jessica said, looking at me with fake pity. We were only trying to do what was best for her. Sarah gave a cold, thin smile. What was best for her? She repeated. She walked back to our table and picked up the large plastic evidence bag, the one we called our secret weapon. Your Honor, the plaintiff Jessica claims my client is senile, but I have in my hand evidence that suggests this senility was part of a very deliberate, premeditated plan. Sarah held up the forged medical report, and beside it, Jessica's own planning notebook. The courtroom went utterly silent. I watched Jessica. The moment she saw that familiar notebook in Sarah's hand, her face went white. All the color drained from her cheeks. The arrogance, the smug confidence, it all vanished, replaced by pure abject terror. Sarah slowly, deliberately read the entries from the notebook, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the quiet room. Entry, dated October 15th. Contact Dr. Peterson, fee $5,000. Entry, dated October 20th. Mix sedative and evening tea. Start low, increase dosage. Goal, admitted to Golden Hope Nursing Facility by end of month. Every word landed like a sledgehammer. People in the gallery gasped. One woman let out a small, horrified cry. Judge Anderson took off her glasses, and her eyes, when she fixed them on Jessica, were filled with an undisguised cold disgust. Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice like steel, this is not a tenant dispute. This is a conspiracy to commit elder abuse. It involves financial exploitation, psychological manipulation, and evidence of attempted poisoning. They didn't just want her house. They wanted to strip a healthy, competent woman of her freedom, her mind, and her assets, and have her locked away in an institution. Jessica just crumpled, dropping her head to the table, and started to sob. But no one was moved by her tears this time. They were the loudest confession of guilt she could have made. David sat beside his lawyer, shrinking in his seat, trying to become invisible. Their entire ugly charade had collapsed. The judge then gave me permission to speak. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket, and took a deep breath. I did not look at David or Jessica. I looked directly at Judge Anderson. Your Honor, I said, my voice wasn't shaking. It was low, and it was sad. I have lived my entire life for my family. I thought a home was a place for love, a place for children to return to when the world hurt them. I was wrong. I raised children who do not understand the value of a home. I paused, gathering my strength. I am not standing here today to ask for money. I am standing here to demand my right to live safely in my own house. The right to grow old with the dignity that every human being deserves. I love my son, but I will not let that love kill me. I am asking this court to restore the peace to my home, so that my husband's spirit may finally rest, and so that I may live my final days without fear of being harmed by my own child. When I finished, there was absolute silence. I saw one of the jurors, a woman about my age, quickly wipe a tear from her eye. Sarah looked at me and gave me a proud, strong nod. I had spoken my truth. Judge Anderson put her glasses back on and gripped her gavel. She looked at David and Jessica with a severity that sent a chill through the room. In my 20 years on this bench, she said, her voice ringing with authority, I have rarely seen a case that has so morally outraged me. You two have not only violated a sacred trust, you have trampled on the most basic values of human decency. She banged the gavel. The court dismisses the plaintiff's lawsuit for wrongful eviction in its entirety. On the contrary, the court grants Mrs. Margaret's countersuit. I am issuing a permanent order of eviction against David and Jessica. A restraining order is effective immediately, prohibiting either of you from coming within 500 yards of Mrs. Margaret or her property. Any remaining belongings will be removed under police supervision within 24 hours. She stopped for a moment, letting that sink in, before delivering the final blow. Furthermore, given the disturbing evidence presented regarding the falsified medical records and the conspiracy to administer unauthorized sedatives, I am referring this entire case file to the District Attorney's Office for immediate review for criminal prosecution for elder abuse and conspiracy to commit battery. This court is adjourned. The final copt of the gavel was sharp and absolute. David and Jessica simply collapsed into their chairs, their faces ashen, the word criminal hanging in the air above them. A bailiff moved toward them. David looked at me one last time, his eyes wide with panic, pleading. I turned away. He had been given every chance. He chose greed, and now he would have to face the consequences. I walked out of the courtroom with Sarah. As we pushed through the heavy doors, the bright morning sun hit my face. After so many dark days, the light was almost blinding. It shone down on the courthouse steps, warming my shoulders. I took a deep, shuddering breath, filling my lungs with the fresh, free air. The 1,000-pound weight I had been carrying for months was finally, suddenly gone. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a deluded old woman. I was a survivor. I reached out and took Sarah's hand, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I smiled. A real smile, one of pure, unburdened relief. Justice had been served, and more importantly, I had found myself again. 3 months after the trial, I stood in front of my old house one last time. There was a bright red sold sign planted firmly in the green lawn. A lot of people thought I was crazy to sell the home I'd shared with my husband for 40 years, but that house had served its purpose. It held all my beautiful memories of Arthur, but lately, it also held too much pain. I realize my memories of him are in my heart, not in those brick walls. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life haunted by betrayal, cleaning empty rooms. So I sold it, donated a portion of the money to a legal aid fund for abused elders, and kept the rest for myself. I moved into a beautiful high-rise apartment in a senior community. It's smaller, but it's comfortable, modern, and perfectly safe. I have neighbors my own age, wonderful, funny people, and yes, Arthur visits me here often. This morning, I woke up at 7, not to make breakfast for anyone, but to go to my yoga class. And for the first time in my life, I signed up for an oil painting class, a dream I'd put aside 50 years ago to raise a family. Looking at my half-finished canvas, at all the bright colors dancing on the easel, I'm not just Margaret the widow or Margaret the mother anymore. I'm Margaret the artist, the free woman. David and Jessica, they're just the past now. I hear they're struggling to start over in another state, but I find it no longer bothers me. I learned that you have to let go to be happy. 64 wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a life I am finally living just for me. And you know what? It feels absolutely wonderful. Thank you for walking with me through this storm. Please remember, it is never too late to stand up for your dignity and find your own joy. If this story gave you any strength at all, please leave a purple heart so we can all share the love. Goodbye and take care.